elk hunting seasons. But before we do that, as you and I visited earlier today, on your agenda, number 22, the Elk Management Plan Implementation Update, what we'd like to do is present to you information, not only an update on implementation status of many of the activities associated with the plan itself, but then Andy Lindblom and John Kent will also go over the elk aerial survey results, population estimate, and some other parameters that we use in assessing and monitoring the elk population, which will then lead into our recommendations of the seasons themselves. So I hope you brought popcorn and you're comfortable because we have a lot of information to offer up to you, but I think this will help set the stage for our discussion and looking at the recommendations for the seasons themselves. And to answer your question about, as a page, what do I want to be when I grow up? I hope to work for Game Fish and Park someday when I'm old enough and out in the real world.
Good luck on that.
Look forward to that. Go to school at Vermillion.
I don't have a choice what university I attend. That was chosen by me.
Better get your application in.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So today, John and I are providing updates and recommendations on elk populations in the state. We have a lot of exciting survey and harvest data and analyses to present, and of course these data will lead us directly into our recommendations for elk season proposals. Keep in mind that this is the first time we've brought forward elk season proposals that are for 2 years, so these recommendations for proposals will be for 2016 and 17. Clicker. So as Tom mentioned, we're going to be providing, in addition to updates on survey data and our recommendations for proposal, we will be providing information on implementation of the elk management plan. As you recall, you adopted this elk management plan last year in April of 2015. We have used it since then as a guiding document throughout the year, and also here recently as we develop our recommendations, it's really helped guide us in that process. In that plan, there are 10 objectives and 60 strategies. Of course, we're not going to go over all those today, but many of these objectives and strategies we're going to highlight at the bottom of each slide that it pertains to, so you'll see that objective and strategy listed if it pertains to something we're talking about. But in addition to that, we also have a few that we thought was pertinent to bring up now and highlight and discuss. These are objectives and strategies we've talked about probably at great length before, or they're objectives that are time bound, so they're timely to talk about today. And with that said, John's going to kick us off.
Thank you, Andy, Madam Chair. Maybe quickly for Commissioner Olson, my name is John Kent. I'm the Regional Wildlife Manager. I'm stationed out of Rapid City in Region 1, so I cover roughly the western third of South Dakota, just to introduce myself. Okay, first I'd like to start with covering the objective that's on the screen here, Objective 1, which is to maintain, manage, and protect existing habitat throughout the Black Hills. This is one that Andy and I felt was pretty important to pull out because you folks, at least many of you, might remember that habitat and particularly forage we heard a lot about that from our stakeholder group when we were developing the management plan. Certainly when we went to approve the management plan through the commission, lots of comments related to that. And so this is probably a pretty important one for us to cover from that standpoint. We did hear, particularly from the permittees that graze cattle out on the forest and out on that public land, and so there is a potential for conflict there between cattle and elk, and this is a objective to help address that along with habitat for elk. And so this is under Objective 1, Strategy E. It says work with public land management agencies, conservation organizations, and private landowners to establish and conduct long-term monitoring strategy and to quantify and evaluate elk and other wildlife habitat on the most important elk habitat areas in the Black Hills. Now, underneath of that as a sub-strategy, if you will, we stated that we would
develop a cooperative strategy with the United States Forest Service to monitor that forest and rangeland, that public ground out there in the national forest, particularly in areas that are critical to elk and throughout the year within the Black Hills. So I want to give you a little bit of an update on what we've been doing. We have held, so for almost the last year, we approved the management plan, as Andy said, at our April commission meeting last year. So from that point on, we started discussions with the Forest Service, and we've held a number of different meetings to try and help develop this strategy, objective and strategy. A lot of the discussion has centered around range conditions currently and what things look like out there. Elk numbers and where they occur on that range out there and how that applies to those range conditions. But we've also discussed monitoring. So currently the Forest Service is conducting some monitoring, and so one thing that we've tried to do with them is understand where they're at with that monitoring, what they've accomplished, and take a look at that. Now I can tell you that unfortunately a lot of that information is not readily available, and by that I mean it's not on a computer spreadsheet that they could send over to Andy and I for us to take a look at. A lot of it's in files and cabinets and written down. And so one thing that we've done is entered into an agreement with the Forest Service that will help fund a seasonal position to go ahead and go through all that information, try to organize a lot of that, and digitize it so that we can get a better look at it and kind of understand what their monitoring looks like as it stands right now. And then with that, start or continue our discussion on what we might do to improve that monitoring and expand that monitoring throughout the forest there in those areas that are in particular important to elk. So with that, oops, I'm sorry. I need to cover the rest of my bullets here. Our next meeting is scheduled for March 22nd. Now, within some other objectives, we've also stated that we'll discuss with public land agencies and other organizations our season recommendations. So at that meeting, I intend to cover what the commission proposes here today and advise the Forest Service of that information. And then, of course, we're going to further develop that habitat monitoring design, like I mentioned just a moment ago. What I put up here is just another thing that we've worked with the Forest Service on, and I apologize, you can't read it very well, and I didn't expect you to. What that is a data sheet that we've developed with the Forest Service, and what we're doing is giving them all of the locations from our aerial survey data of groups of elk, of 20 elk or more. So the Forest Service staff, along with some of our staff, are going to go out and visit those sites in the general area, and then use this data sheet to document on a very qualitative basis some of the habitat conditions there, and help try to identify some key areas that we might start to focus our habitat monitoring on, and then develop from there. And as I mentioned up here, this is a qualitative assessment, and what it's going to do is allow us to further those discussions and hopefully narrow things down at exactly how we're going to tackle this and get that monitoring done, and then start to conduct that over the next several years. The last thing I might mention on this is that this is time bound, so we've said that we'll accomplish this by June of 2016, and so the goal of this group and these meetings is to have something in place, a plan in place that we can bring to you in June there, and explain to you how that we're going to move forward with this monitoring. The next objective I'd like to cover is Objective 3, Managing Elk Populations in the Black Hills, and CSP for quantity and quality recreational hunting opportunities, with an emphasis in CSP on viewability for visitors to the park. In particular, Strategy F. So we want to further evaluate the license application and lottery system, and look at the potential to increase the success of applicants with multiple years of preference. And you can see this is time-bound as well. We want to have that accomplished by December of 2016. There has been some work done on this, and by that I mean our Sean Idy, our licensing supervisor, has started to evaluate the current system, look at some potential ways that we might change, and then discuss that with staff. And we have had a few discussions amongst staff, but really beyond that, there hasn't been a lot of movement on this particular strategy. The next strategy I want to talk about is strategy G, which is to further evaluate the current landowner preference system and again determine if any changes are necessary. So Mike Kintai, the regional supervisor, my boss, has led some group discussions with staff out in Region 1. Of course, I've been sitting at the table and included in those discussions. And what we've done this far is come up with a lot of different ideas. Just sat and kind of brainstormed. What do we like about the current system? What could we change? What are some of the issues? What are some of the good things that are working with this particular system right now? And so we've identified all of those and discussed them. And again, hoping to come up with some recommendations to bring to the commission, by December of 2016. Now, I would tell you with both of these strategies, please understand that one of the options is no change. So we may go through this and decide that, really the way things are operating now is working, and it's probably the best that we can do. And so we may come back and offer no change as an alternative with these. I'll pass it over to Andy.
So the next couple objectives we want to talk about. Objective 2, we want to it's the objective to manage for biologically and socially acceptable elk populations. Now the strategy I want to reference here is strategy G, and that is we put in there that we're going to biannually evaluate environmental and range conditions. And we even put a time on that. We said when we're developing season recommendations in February, and also again in mid to late summer. Now, as you recall, last year we brought recommendations forward to you with regard to our contingency licenses. So in July we did meet with the Forest Service. We went over their precip data, their data they have on plant development, forage utilization, water availability, rainfall patterns, any adjustments to grazing, those types of things. We had good discussion, a good meeting with the Forest Service, and that helped kind of inform our decision on what we wanted to do as far as a recommendation to the Commission on contingency licenses. So a little bit of update on what we did there. Also, before our recommendation process here today, we did look at the precip data we have from last year all the way up until this point. So you can see here this graph. These are for our elk units. All the different colors pertain to the elk units. This line here would be normal precip. So anything above that line is above precip, and of course below is below precip. You can see the drought we had in 2012. That was obviously a substantial drought. But luckily since then, 2013, 14, and 15, we've been above annual precip. So this is good data for at least as far as we're concerned for our elk season recommendations, and something to consider. Under Objective 2, Strategy G again, we do have about 3 sub-objectives I want to talk about briefly. The first one is to allocate sufficient antlerless licenses. Of course, what we're bringing forward to you today, we feel we're meeting that objective. We do feel we are recommending sufficient antlerless licenses to meet our population objectives. The next one is to promulgate administrative rule, and this is for our contingency licenses. You guys did accomplish that last year. And the third part there is that during periods of drought that last more than a year, we want to set our harvest strategies to move the elk population down towards the lower end of our objective range. As you recall, and we're going to talk about today quite a bit, our population objective in the elk plan is 7,000 elk, but in that plan we said that objective can range between 6,000 and 8,000 depending on range conditions, and that's really important, and this strategy highlights that. When the range conditions aren't there, we don't want to manage for 7,000 or the high end of the objective. We want to manage down for 6,000. So we've laid that out in this strategy. So now we want to get into our survey data and talk about some survey and research updates. The first survey I want to talk about is our harvest survey. You can see there at the bottom of the slide, this will be a common thing that you see. We're referencing a couple strategies, different objectives in our plan that reference what we're talking about. We're probably not going to cover those every single time, but you can see where they are relative to our management plan. So for harvest surveys, we have a hunter survey, and we survey all of our elk hunters. This is unique. We usually take a random sample of hunters, but since our elk hunter numbers are fewer, we do survey 100% of them. We use electronic and mailing cards. Last year, about 65% of the responses were electronic. And we have really good response rates. You can see there for Firearm about 73%, Archery 90%. Those are really good response rates. In addition, we also have mandatory 24-hour check, where a hunter has to check a harvested elk either into Game and Fish staff, into an office, or one of about a dozen established check stations across the Black Hills. And when they check these animals in, we gather harvest information, and most importantly, we get tooth data. This also allows the hunter to submit a voluntary CWD submission if he wants to have his elk checked for CWD. So just real briefly here on elk harvest over time here. This really shows the story of elk management in the state of South Dakota. As you recall, in the late 1800s, elk were extirpated from South Dakota. And beginning in the early 1900s, we started to bring a few back in. But we were doing elk reintroductions all the way up until 1990. So this is really pretty much a new phenomenon for us as far as this much elk harvest. You can see elk harvest began in the late 1900s, really started to ramp up till, in the early 2000s, we started getting a lot of elk. At the same time, we also went into about 8-9 years of drought as well. So we really ramped up our harvest. You can see the black or the red bars here is the cow elk harvest. You can see there, we almost harvested up to 1,000 cow elk one year. A couple years before and after that, we were around that 900 range. We did get into our elk population, backed off on that harvest, and now we're kind of in the rebuilding phase. You can see this harvest start to ramp up again. One important thing I like to make note of is the blue here. This is our bull harvest. We have sustained relatively high levels of bull harvest in relation to our cow harvest these past few years in order to try to provide that opportunity there. And even during these past few years of lower elk numbers, we were substantially higher than we've ever been, almost previous to 2000. So from that harvest data, we get incisor teeth from every harvested animal that's checked in. We look at tooth wear, and we put that into 4 different age categories: calf, yearling, 2 to 3 year old, and 4+ year olds. We have evaluated ourselves on this and whether or not our evaluation of tooth wear and ages are correct. We did this about 4 years ago. We went ahead and we aged everything according to wear on the incisor teeth. Then we took those teeth and we sent it into Matson's lab, where they actually section the tooth and they count cementum annuli, and they actually get a precise age on it. And we were about 95% accurate. So we feel pretty good about our incisor tooth age data. So in 2014, this is kind of the category we're looking at here. This is in the management plan. You can see here we want to manage for at least 30% of our harvested bulls in this 4+ years or older age category. So in 2014, we're at 45%. And this last year, you can see here in 2015, we're at about 33%. So we're really approaching that management objective. We really don't want that to get any lower. So you're going to see our recommendations today reflect that. Another survey we do is our fall herd composition survey. This is a survey where we get age and sex composition data. We do this in the late summer, early fall, August and September, and these are random ground counts. So these are our age data. This is our calf to 100 cow ratio from about the last 10 years. You can see the bars is the actual ratio. We've averaged about 50 calves per 100 cows. This is the long-term average here, this red bar. This last year we were at about 53 calves per 100 cows, which is really good recruitment. This recruitment estimate is essential to our population modeling. You can see the error bars here. These are our 95% confidence intervals. And then the dots here are just our sample sizes. We've had really good sampling effort here. In past years, we've been over 1,000 animals that we've actually counted and classified. So we have some pretty good age composition data. In addition, we look at sex composition. This is our bulls to 100 cows ratio. We've averaged about 30 here, you can see, from about 2013 to 2015. Last year, we were a little bit above that at about 37 bulls per 100 cows. This also is important data that we put into our population modeling. And the next one I want to talk about is the aerial elk survey. We just completed that this year, and we have some exciting data to present. Before I get into the data, I want to talk a little bit about the survey itself. We don't just get up and fly helicopters around and count elk. We do use the siteability model, and we need a model so we can actually estimate how many animals we miss out there using the detection probability factor. We've developed this model in South Dakota through research, cooperative research with South Dakota State University, and also some of our own research. And it essentially is a logistic regression model. And the variables that we use in that equation are group size, vegetative cover, and snow cover. So those are some of the most important variables for elk detection. And these pictures kind of demonstrate that as well. What we're saying here, the model is saying, is that larger groups out in the snow with no cover are a lot easier to detect. Kind of makes sense. Up here, smaller group, no snow, vegetative cover, kind of hard to see, but there's about 50 elk in there. So we did a complete aerial survey in 2013, and we just completed this one here in 2016. This year we also flew the aerial survey protocol in the Black Hills portion of Wyoming, and we flew this with South Dakota crew, but Wyoming Game and Fish did fund the helicopter time there. So it was a cooperative effort. Overall, we spent about 230 survey hours. About 195 of those were in South Dakota. So this is a big effort. We had 3 R-44 helicopters going. A lot of Game and Fish staff put a lot of time in the helicopter, not only surveying but coordinating and getting this put together. So this is a big effort here. A few things about the survey. It's important to note that this gives us an abundance of wintering elk in the Black Hills. Obviously, these are elk that are wintering in the Black Hills, and this is actually what our population objective is in the elk management plan. It's for wintering elk. And it also gives us a snapshot of elk winter distribution, but that would vary based on what month we did it on, based on snow conditions that year, and those types of things. So a little bit about the methods. In order to get this accomplished, we divided the hills into, can't see them all, but these are 253 individual subunits that take about an hour to fly, a little bit less than an hour at times. We flew all of those subunits, 100% of every subunit, and this is really unique in that most of our surveys were taking a random sample and extrapolating from that. Not in the case with our elk survey. We're flying 100% of the Black Hills. A little bit about some of the techniques here. You can see our transect width, our height. We're just right off the treetops there at relatively low speeds, 40 to 50 miles an hour. Of course, at every observation we record a location, but also those variables that are important to the siteability model that I just went over. This year we got it done in about 3 weeks. Like I said before, we had 3 different helicopters going most of the time. Last year it took us about 5 weeks, so we cut that survey time down in about two weeks, which is really important. We tried to fly the subunits as close together as we could, barring any bad weather. We did have a few bad weather days, which we always do. You can't do anything about that, but we did fly it as fast as we could. Of course, we mapped all of our groups, and we did go back later and evaluate the entire map of the hills for any potential double counting. We did remove a few small groups and even a couple larger groups that we felt were double counts. Any group that was larger than 50, we did take a picture of and count later. I think that's really important to accuracy of the survey. And we do know that there are a few groups people knew on the ground that we missed. We do know we missed a few elk, and that's what the siteability model's for. Just to give you an idea of the importance of pictures. So this is a picture of a group of elk we took, and I don't know if anybody's brave enough to yell out how many elk they think are in there, but you can think about how many elk you think are in there. There's about 300 elk right there when you take a picture, and is that what you're going to say, Commissioner Cooper? So here's another group of elk, a little harder to see there, but running along here, a little more spread out. When you take the picture out, blow it up, we put dots on every single animal and count them up. There's over 500 animals there. So pictures are worth 1,000 words, and we really spend a lot of time on those pictures. And this is the biggest elk group that we counted this year. It's a big group. Anybody care to take a step? Close. It was 1,222.
I guess I didn't add the other.
So yeah, it was a big group of elk, and they were actually in the trees, and they spent some time. You can kind of herd them out of the trees and get them out in the open, and then you can get pictures and get a good count on them. So a little more quantitative results here. So for our Black Hills hunting units, now this excludes Custer State Park and Wind Cave. Our total count, and these are the animals we actually counted, was 6,356. So those are animals we counted, not counting the model or anything. We put it in the citability model, which corrects for the ones we missed. We're talking 7,200 elk. You can see the confidence interval there from about 6,700 to 9,100. So our estimate this year for the Black Hills, excluding the parks, is going to be 7,200. For Custer State Park, we counted about 378 elk. Our model estimate is 460. For Wind Cave, we did fly Wind Cave for them and got a count of the elk that they have in Wind Cave. Counted about 484 and a population estimate of about 700. And then, like I mentioned before, we did fly the Wyoming side for them and for us too. We do share elk with Wyoming. We counted 923, and the model estimate there is 1,100 animals. This is a distribution map of the animals that we counted this year in 2016. This hot spot here, this is the Jasper Fire area, of which, you know, in previous surveys we know this is an important winter range for elk in the Black Hills. But you can see them distributed here. A lot of elk do tend to move out of Unit 1 in the wintertime. That's where we have some heavier snowfalls. But we had a few up there, a few up here that we share with Unit 7. Of course, we have some counts in Wyoming. And then in Unit 3 was probably our next biggest counts, of course, outside of Wind Cave. Compare that with the distribution of 2013 survey, just to give you an idea. Again, very, very similar. This is the Jasper Fire area, a very important winter area for elk in the Black Hills. Another survey I want to briefly talk about here is survival monitoring. We do radio collar elk in the Black Hills. This last year we collared about another 25 elk. This was completely funded by Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. They're great conservation partners for managing elk. They paid for the helicopter capture costs and the radio collar costs. So this is really, really helpful us to increase our sample size of elk that we have collared in the hills. So between last year and this year, we have about 87 cows currently collared in the hills. We will monitor survival and update every year into our population model. This last year, for 2015, we had 87% annual survival, which is really good survival. Of course, one thing that we're looking forward to doing is being able to quantify the impacts of potential increased antlerless harvest on cow survival. And that's going to be really important updates for our population models. Give you an idea of where we captured in the last couple of years. The red dots are the elk captures were radio collared animals in 2015. The green are 2016. This last year we were able to get some animals up here in Unit 1 and add to these Unit 2 7 animals. So what's this all mean as far as population growth? Of course, we put together all of our survey data and put it into a model. We also look at the research data that we've done in the past in CSP in Unit 2. And we do have a growing elk population. There's no doubt about that. And John's going to talk about some of the specifics on that as he goes over license recommendations and the impacts of those recommendations. But just briefly here, just covering the two citability models for 2013. Remember, we were at about 5,100 was our estimate for the Black Hills hunting units, excluding the parks. Whereas this year, you can see the increase to 7,200. Last year, we will admit this, we projected the elk population to be at about 6,500 versus 7,200. So our models were a little bit conservative last year. We predicted definitely an increasing population, but not to the level of 7,200. One further thing I want to mention on population growth is, if you recall, you have this chart in your elk management plan. I think you'll find this very useful, but this really kind of explains some of the background behind our population models. So here's our fall recruitment. Right now we're at about 50 calves per 100 cows, and you can look at what the impacts will be if you have less recruitment. This is our overwinter calf survival. I didn't talk about this, but from research, we've been seeing about 90% overwinter calf survival. So we're at the high end here. So you look at that in relation to where we are as far as adult female survival. We're at about 87%. So this kind of shows, you know, it's obviously qualitative here, but it gives you an idea of how fast that population will grow. We're obviously between the 2 and 3 year-olds, so a relatively fast population growth as far as elk populations are going. If we ramp up the antlerless harvest and we reduce this cow survival to 80% or even lower, that will have a substantial impact on population growth, just to kind of illustrate that. And one other thing I think it's important to consider as we look at our license recommendations, we just completed this Ben Simpson's research on elk, and these are animals that were radio collared in 2012 and 13, I believe. Or 13 and 14, 12 and 13, I think. But these are where they calved. All these animals were radio collared and captured in the wintertime down in the Jasper Fire area, basically, or in Unit 2. So these animals really spread out. We also have seen that with the animals that we radio collared here. The red are where we captured them here in recent years, and the green is where we located them in the summer. So these animals do spread out, and we do share animals with Wyoming. About 7.5% of the animals that were captured in Unit 2 spent their time, the hunting season, in Wyoming. So about 7.5% of the animals are not available for harvest in South Dakota. So I think that's something important to consider as we look at the numbers and licenses. And looking at Wyoming's data, again, this is the estimate for Wyoming, 1,100. Our South Dakota estimate is 7,200. Just comparing harvest here, I could only find Wyoming's 2014 harvest, but Wyoming's harvest was 380. Our harvest the same year was 500. Look at that in relation to the population estimates, at least in the wintertime. It is obvious that we are giving Wyoming quite a few elk, so we need to consider that as we do our license recommendations. And with that, I'll turn it over to John.
Thank you. Just a few more slides. Hang in there, and we'll get down to some nitty-gritty here. I've got a bit more information to share with you, and then I want to talk about the recommendations and go through those with you so we can explain exactly what we're talking about there. First, I'd like to talk about our objective map. And so we do set objectives by unit on an annual basis, and of course, we had this in the plan, but we continue to update that on an annual basis. And you see, this does fit with again another one of our objectives and strategies. So what you're looking at is this is a map of all of our elk management units, both Prairie, Black Hills, and of course Custer State Park. As you can see over here, red means decrease, blue means increase, and green we'd want to try to maintain that population. So if I could, I want to go through each of these as quickly here, but just give you a little bit of information. I'll start with the Prairie units. So down here in Bennett County, this Unit 11 down here, that does include a little bit of Jackson County and then a chunk of Millette County there as well. So we have substantially decreased. And just a couple of important notes there. We do have herds of elk, both from the Pine Ridge Reservation and Rosebud Reservation, that come over, particularly into Bennett County, and cause some pretty significant depredation concerns to private land there, both on standing crops and stored feeds there in Bennett and Jackson, and then to a lesser extent Millette counties. And so I point that out because that'll become important when we look at our recommendations in a moment. Jump over to Prairie Unit 27A here. So we do have if I can hold this steady enough, we've got a group of elk, a herd of elk that are just south of our Black Hills Management 3 that again have crossed that Cheyenne River, are down there on private land and caused some damage throughout the year. And so we do manage that herd as a Prairie unit down there. That unit is big as well as the Bennett County unit, just for simplification purposes. There's not elk throughout those areas. But it just to identify a simple boundary, we make them bigger like that. Jump up here to Prairie Unit 9, which does include this area around the Piedmont area here east of I-90, and then up around the St. Onge and Whitewood area here to the north of I-90. So again, all private land, elk that have moved north and east out of the Black Hills and are causing some pretty significant damages to private land there, and we do have that listed as a substantially decrease as well. The last prairie unit I'll touch on is 15 up here, which does, it's in Butte County and right along the Wyoming border. And so what we deal with there is we do have a resident group of elk that causes damage, particularly to a lot of irrigated alfalfa and some other standing crops in there, and of course stored feed again. And then we have elk that come back and forth out of Wyoming into that unit. And obviously when we get a big group move in out of there, can cause damage to private property as well. Then I'll just touch briefly on the Black Hills units, and you'll see that Unit 2 here, our big unit where Andy showed you most of our elk occur, we are looking at slightly decrease, as well as Southern Unit 3, where again we have, boy, I just can't hold that steady, higher densities of elk, and we deal with private property issues down there as well. And then out here in Northern Unit 3 and on this eastern and northern front, if you will, we're looking to increase elk populations by and large in there. Set aside Unit 9, which again, Unit 9 is predominantly private land, and we are seeing the elk numbers increase pretty dramatically there, and dealing with a little bit of private property damage. So we feel like we're in a good spot there and want to maintain that herd of elk. What I wanted to touch on, the way that we develop these objectives is we look, of course, at all the research and survey data that Andy just covered with you, and I'll cover some here in a moment. We also take into consideration habitat, depredation or damage to private property, as I mentioned, and then input. We take lots of input. We hold open houses. We meet with landowners. We hold landowner input meetings, sportsman input meetings, and of course we conduct a lot of surveys to take input as well. And so all of that information goes into our decisions to as to where we put these objectives on these various units. So with that, I'd like to start just jumping right into some harvest information for the various seasons. And so what I have up here is your Prairie Elk Harvest information going back to 2006. And just a couple things I'll point out. Notice the success rate, and we do see that success fluctuates a bit out in these prairie seasons. And go back to what I was just talking about in those prairie units, and we have issues with elk moving in and out of the state from Wyoming, on and off the reservations there where we can't hunt those elk. And so if one year a group of elk doesn't move in from those places, that certainly can impact success. And there's some other things that impact success as well with weather and such. And so it does fluctuate a bit. Another point of interest here is on the side we have average satisfaction, and so 1 would be not satisfied, if you will, and a 7 is very satisfied. And so do by and large have pretty good satisfaction in that prairie elk harvest or that prairie elk season there. So with that, I want to jump right into our prairie elk recommendations, and you have all these in your packets in front of you, but I just want to go through them quickly again and make sure that you understand each of these. And so we are looking to adjust the number of licenses from 48 any elk and 50 antlerless elk to 59 any elk and 90 antlerless elk. And it does break that out by unit, as Tony mentioned earlier in your packet there. Number 2, we want to add a portion of Meade County to that Prairie Unit 9. And if you don't mind, let me come back to this on the next slide. I have a map where I can talk a little bit more about that and give you more information on that. We want to change the season dates for Unit 15A and Unit 27A. And I'll tell you that in these prairie units, we work very closely with our private landowners. Pretty much all of the land in these prairie units is private land. We rely totally on access from those private landowners to get in and harvest these elk. And so we do work very closely with them on season dates, license numbers, and all the specifics on that season. And so the season date changes come directly from those landowners asking us to switch those season dates as that better fits their opportunities to host those hunters and then increase that harvest success. So jumping back to number 2 in that addition to Prairie Elk Unit 9, so you can see here's our Prairie Elk units again, and this is that Prairie Elk Unit 9 to the north and east of I-90. And what we're asking the commission to propose is an addition to that Piedmont area of Prairie Elk Unit 9, which is this area up here. We are seeing that as we continue to harvest these animals and pressure these animals, that they're starting to move into some new areas. And unfortunately, in those new areas, we deal with new private landowners that have stored feed and crops that are suffering damage. And so really the impetus behind adding this area to that unit is simply to include landowners within that unit so that we can put hunters on their place during the season and help harvest some of those elk and, of course, pressure them and try to address some of those depredation issues. Next, I'll talk about Custer State Park. And just go through a couple of things I have. On the top is the archery elk season and success rates and applicants. And one thing that I point out again is the success rate. You can see that it's fluctuated a bit and actually dropped considerably into the 2011, 2012 here, and then jumped back up in recent years to actually really good success. Something to point out is in 2013, prior to the 2013 season, that is when we pushed elk out of Wind Cave up into Custer State Park. And so you could see that had a direct impact on success. I attribute most, if not all of that, to those elk being pushed up out of Wind Cave National Park. On the bottom, I have the Firearm elk season. And again, what I would point out is the number of applicants, the number of interests we have in both of these seasons. And in this case, success doesn't fluctuate quite as much, but you do see that, from about 2012 on, 100% success, and we jumped to really high success there in the park. Now, I would mention that licenses have dropped considerably since the mid-2000s, and so that certainly helps increase that success rate too. So, jump right into recommendations for Custer State Park, and the first is the antlerless elk recommendation that I'd like to talk about. We are asking for 20 antlerless elk licenses to be spread 10 each in 2 periods, and you could see the dates up there in October. As I mentioned a moment ago, we did push those elk out of Wind Cave up into Custer State Park. And what we're seeing is that the remnants of that group, about 200 elk, are hanging in this southern portion of Custer State Park. If you use this, if I can hold it still again, this line here and below is what's called the R&D pasture. And so this red south line here does border Wind Cave National Park, and what we're seeing is those elk just continue to spend most of the year in this pasture down here along that fence with Wind Cave. And so what we'd like to do, this pasture is very important to bison management, and so what we'd like to do is try to disperse those elk and pressure those elk out of that area and move them further north into the park so that they're not spending all of their time on that range and competing with those bison. And so we've identified a boundary here that we feel would be suitable to get those hunters in there, allow for them to have good success, and put some pressure on those elk again and try to move them further north into the park. I did put up the last time that we had the season here, which was 2012, and you could see from 2006 on to 2012, we've significantly reduced those licenses, and then, of course, the season's been closed since 2011. And so we're looking or asking the commission to propose to open that season again and help us to move those elk out of that southern portion of Custer State Park. The other part of the Custer State Park recommendation is to change the any elk licenses from 8 to 9 and the archery elk licenses from 4 to 3. And I put the Objective 3 Strategy E down here, and what that says is that we'll allocate 25% of the any elk licenses to archers and 75% to rifle. And so look at this as more of a cleanup, if you will. We want to ensure that we're following the plan, and so with the 9 rifle and the 3 archery, it would be that 75%, 25%. So going back to what Andy was talking about in those projection models, and of course the aerial survey estimate, and then referring to the plan. So our population objective is 700 to 900 elk in Custer State Park. So we're shooting for that 800. And as Mandy mentioned, the 2016 aerial survey winter population estimate was 455 elk in Custer State Park. And so what I've done is given you an idea of what would happen if we didn't make any changes to licenses here for the next couple years, and then if we do. And so you can see with no change to licenses that were offered in 2015, we would see a winter estimate in 2017 of about 480 elk, so some growth in that population. With the recommended changes, those 20 antlerless licenses in particular, we would see that population roughly start to stabilize. So that winter estimate in 2017 would be about 460 elk. So just to give you an idea of what those would do for the population. Next, I'll jump on to Black Hills Firearm Elk Harvest. And a number of different things to point out with this chart here. Just notice the huge interest in these licenses, and of course that objective and strategy I talked about at the beginning is a way that we can better allocate these licenses to try and accommodate more of those applicants. But nonetheless, you can see that we have about 12,000 people applying annually for these licenses. You can see that in the last year or so here, we've seen an increase to licenses sold, and with that, an increase to the total number of elk harvested. And of course, success rates looking pretty good these last few years, with an overall success rate in the 70s there for the most part. And again, I would just quickly point out the average satisfaction going back quite a ways out of that 1 to 7 scale. We're looking pretty good. This is just a different way to look at that information, and so you can see this line with the triangles is the number of applicants, and so that's kind of stabilized, if you will, at that 12,000 range for the last several years. Success is the line with the circles, and we are, again, maintaining pretty darn good success in the Black Hills as you work backwards. This graph goes back to 1966. And then, of course, you have harvest with the line with black circles, and licenses sold with the line with the black squares. And Andy pointed this out previously with that graph that he showed you, or that chart that he showed you. But you could see here in the mid-2000s, we were harvesting a lot of elk. And, you know, we're still maintaining a fair amount of harvest in the Black Hills there when you look back again to 1966 there, and a fair amount of opportunity, really. So this is just a different way to look at that information. As Andy mentioned a bit ago, we do take online respondents from our harvest surveys, and so about 65% of people responded online. And what we have here, they had the option of clicking on a map and showing where they harvested their animal. And so this is what they call a heat map, and it just shows where that harvest occurred throughout the Black Hills. So this is Archery and Firearm, and it represents 468 harvest locations. But no big surprise, this is where the concentration of elk are, and that's where the concentration of harvest was. So, jumping into our season recommendation for rifle elk. And I'm going to break this up by the numbers in your book there, and I'll start with number 1, which is the license allocations and those any elk licenses. And so I do have the any elk map over here just for your reference. And what we're asking is for an increase from 430 any elk licenses to 443. Those increases are in Unit 4 here, which is this unit to the east of Wind Cave National Park and Custer State Park. We did have a landowner meeting there last week, and talked with our neighbors there to Custer State Park. And surprising to me, they weren't quite ready to crack the season open. They were a little bit hesitant. And so after much discussion with them, they did decide that they want to crack it open, but they weren't ready to offer antlerless licenses. And we are starting to see a little bit of damage to private property in that unit. And of course, we did count, a couple of wads of elk in there. So we want to start to crack that season open and start to get ahead of those elk there, albeit we still want to increase that elk herd. But nonetheless, those landowners felt like if we started with some any elk licenses to get that season open and get it started, that would be the way to go. And so we're asking for 8 any elk licenses in Unit 4. We'd also like to increase the any elk licenses in Unit 7. We saw 100% success on these 15 licenses last year, and so just give a little bit more opportunity there and feel like that we have the animals out there to increase that harvest. The other part of number 1 in your packet is the Antlerless license allocation, and so a little bit different story with units here. I've put that unit map up, and you'll notice that Unit 5 and Unit 4 are not shown on this map, and that's because we're not asking for any antlerless licenses in those units. But we want to go from 500 antlerless elk licenses to 1,255 antlerless licenses, so a significant jump in licenses. And predominantly that jump is in Unit 2 here, and you have this in your packet as well, but you could see last year we issued 400 antlerless elk licenses in Unit 2 split between the north and south, and so we want to increase that allocation to 1,000 antlerless licenses for the 2016 and 17 season. Now, I'm going to get into season dates in a moment, but we do want to split those licenses up amongst units and seasons, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute as well, but with 1,000 licenses, which is more licenses than we've had in Unit 2 ever, and so that does pose a little bit of an issue because that's a lot of hunters to put in the field, and so we want to split those up amongst units and season dates, as I mentioned, to help avoid crowding issues and issues with hunters competing with each other in the field there. The other increase would be to Unit 3. So we are going to open up the north half of Unit 3 with antlerless seasons, or we're asking you to do that. And then we want to add antlerless licenses to the southern Unit 3 here. And again, we have in the past and continue to see depredation issues in that southern portion, which is predominantly private property, and they deal with big groups of elk on their properties there. So number 2 in your booklet is to make adjustments to existing antlerless units. And so what we're asking is for you to create a new antlerless unit in Unit 2, which is this area here, and you have this map in your booklet again. That formerly was part of this northern area in Unit 2. The reason that we'd like to create that is in part based on discussions with landowners in that area that are suffering some depredation on their private property, but also, again, to distribute those hunters. We'd like to spread the hunters out and force them into areas, if you will, to help try to avoid that crowding issue and spreading those hunters out. And so I threw up this heat map, and what it is just the antlerless harvest. I showed you all harvest before on that heat map, and this depicts the antlerless harvest. And you can see that right now in that area, which would be right here on this map, there's very little antlerless harvest that occurs there. And so in an effort to, as I mentioned, to force those hunters over there and get us some harvest in those areas that are on and adjacent to those private properties, we'd like to create that third antlerless unit in Unit 2.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
John, maybe I'm not reading this right, but so when we create, or what you're requesting is that we create, let's just take that Unit 2 that you just talked about. You got H2, B, C, and D, right?
Yep.
And then down here, we have a set number of licenses for each of those. H2, B would be 200, and then C and D. What distinguishes where they can hunt in that unit? That's all lumped together. Is that based upon season dates?
Correct. Yep, and I'll explain those in a minute. But yep, you're absolutely correct, Commissioner Cooper.
All right.
And here we go. So 3, 4, and 5 in your booklet is a change to season dates. And so as Commissioner Cooper just mentioned, just as an example, that northern antlerless unit in Unit 2 is HB, C, and D. And so if you go to the chart that's in your book, it would show H2B here, which would be October 17th through 31, H2C, which would be December 1 through 16, and H2D, which would be December 17th through the 31st. And then the same would hold true with H2 H2E, and then H2H in this small unit here, and then so on and so forth with the different letters. And so again, we're asking to create those separate season dates, and we would make the hunter select that period, pardon me, that they want to hunt in, to help spread them out again. Pardon me, talking too much. It's a big surprise. Okay, jump on to archery elk. Just a few more slides, I promise. Again, I would just point out the amount of interest here, and our success rates, really good success rates for, thank you very much, archery success rate on elk if you compare that to other states. And again, that satisfaction score, we're up in the mid fives here, and so looking really good as far as that survey goes. Jump over to this graph again, and not to belabor this, but a lot of the same things that you saw on the chart, but this line with the open triangles again is our applicants, and something to notice with archery is just this dramatic increase in archery applicants, and that continues to increase. So we'll see if that plateaus here over the next several years, but for right now, we're seeing that increase annually. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the line with the open circles is success, and we're seeing that success has creeped up, and it's hanging right in there around that 35% success. So, for the archery elk season recommendation, I would focus you to this objective and strategy first. Similar to Custer State Park, we do want to allocate 25% of the any elk licenses to archers, and 10% of the antlerless licenses to archers. And so we'd ask for an increase from 144 any elk licenses and 56 antlerless elk licenses to 147 any elk licenses and 140 antlerless elk licenses. And that simply increases those licenses to make those percentages as we've stated in the plan. And this is just a quick look at those archery units. As you can see, Unit 9 and 4, we're asking that we keep those closed. Those are predominantly private land units, and there's very limited opportunity for archers in those units. And so rather than issue those licenses and put an archery hunter in a position that he or she may have that tag in their pocket, yet no place to get on that has elk to hunt, we just add those licenses into Unit 2 where there's lots of public land, and they'll have that opportunity. And so then overall, hills wide, we have that 75-25 allocation for any elk and that 90-10 for the antlerless elk licenses. And so as we did with Custer State Park, I'll just quickly talk about what this means for the overall population. So as Andy mentioned earlier, our population objective is 6,000 to 8,000 elk, or 7,000 elk, if you will. And the 2016 aerial survey winter population estimate was 7,200 elk. So looking at that model projection again, if we didn't make any changes to licenses this year and left them the same as they were in 2015, we'd see a projected increase from the model to 8,000 elk. And so we'd be at that high end of our range, and in a bit of hurt, if you ask me, because we'd really have to ramp things up, and we'd be struggling to get that population back down. And so with the recommended change, which again is a fairly significant increase to those antlerless licenses, we'd show a slight increase to the population, or the model shows a slight increase. And again, this all excludes Wind Cave National Park and Custer State Park, of approximately 7,400 elk. With the increase that we've recommended, that would stabilize that elk population in Unit 2. So those hot spots that Andy showed you and where the bulk of our elk are, that would stabilize that population. And so to wrap things up, I'd like to take you back to that objectives map quickly and just point out to you again that we are looking to slightly decrease in Unit 2 and down here in Unit 3. I'm just going to speak to the Black Hills units. But we are looking to increase elk along this eastern front and up here in H1 and the northern part of Unit 3. And so when you consider that slight increase that's projected by the model to the population, we'd want that increase to occur in those blue units, if you will, and we want to start to decrease the population in the units in red. Just kind of puts that number into perspective for you. And Andy talked a bit about this earlier on, but we do have those contingency licenses that you folks put into place, and we'll continue to monitor precipitation and range conditions. And if we move through spring and summer here and things start to deteriorate, we'll meet with the Forest Service and, of course, come to you folks. I believe that's at our August commission meeting, and talk about those contingency licenses and the need based on that assessment of the habitat and conditions out there. And with that, I'll take any questions you might have. Thank you for your attention.
Really good report. That's amazing. Should we take a health break and then come back to questions, or will that get us out of the mode?
I'll have my questions before or after.
Okay.
Either way.
What-
Madam Chair, Andy and I have an appointment. I'm just
Okay, why don't we take a 5-minute break and then get right back